You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Forhad. Hope you are all doing well. I'm joined today by a very, very good friend, a mentor, a client, and attorney, and overall great guy, my friend Jim Denlea. As with all of our guests, it would take way too long to talk about everything in Jim's background. So I'm going to give you just some high level highlights. First, he's the founding partner of Denlea Carton in Westchester. He began his career as a Westchester County ADA. He began his legal career, I should say, as a Westchester County ADA. He's been an attorney for about 40 years, where he's represented the interests of people, corporations, both on the plaintiff side and the defendant side. So he's played offense and defense. And throughout his career, he's remained hyper focused on protecting his clients from both known and unforeseeable risks. He's a perennial super lawyer, and we've worked on many, many things together. Needless to say, I think very, very highly of him. So we were introduced many years ago by a mutual friend with the initials JM. We'll know if he's listening to these podcasts if either you or I hear from him, Jim. So thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Fahad. Thank you for the kind words and the nice introduction.
Absolutely. We've had, as you know, we've had a chance to work together over the years on many, many things. And and I mean no offense by this, Jim, but while the people, situations, and details may differ, one thing remains constant. If there are attorneys involved, there usually is a conflict which has to be resolved, right? Regardless of what side you start on or where you end up, any situation like this can cause damage to you, your organization, and your brand, right? So I thought, we discussed this beforehand, so we thought it'd be a good idea to have a discussion about managing this type of situation once it occurs, but probably more importantly, how to be prepared to deal with it beforehand, right?
Right. It's the proverbial ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and it's particularly in today's environment, the threats that can cause crises are ever present and broadening in scope. You can have natural disaster event crises like happened down in Texas with their energy grid. You can have cyber crime, which with ransomware and malware and everything of that nature, where the FBI reports that losses are up over 147% in the last year alone. And you can have just individual or corporate crises that arise in conflicts with competitors, or someone trying to create problems for your corporation, your organization, or for a high net worth individual. So the environment for crises has changed considerably in the past 5 years, and definitely over the last 10 years. And preparedness has never been more of an issue than it is today.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I think crises are definitely dynamic. I mean, they continue to change and evolve, and obviously think about the past year, right? It's something that people knew about, knew that it could happen, but really came about very quickly, and I would say unexpectedly. So there's one case that comes to mind that we worked on together. This is quite a few years ago. With a prominent and wealthy family from outside the US that ran into an issue while traveling here. You remember that case?
Oh, I remember it very well, like it was yesterday. It was.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Talk about a little bit about the details, and then we'll
Sure.
talk about everything else. Yep.
It was very interesting because you and your colleagues were kind enough to reach out to us in the setting. And it was very much a crisis, and it was one that was evolving. And in a way, it serves as an interesting metaphor for the entire topic that we're discussing today, because there were two entities involved, and one of them was exceptionally well prepared in the realm of crisis management, and the other one was not prepared at all. And as the crisis unfolded, we saw what happens when one side is prepared and the other side is not equally prepared.
Yep.
And basically what happened was that there was a very affluent family from the Middle East, and they were traveling with an entourage, and they had exceptional prominence in their home country, both in diplomatic circles and high net worth individual circles. And they were staying at a very well-known hotel in New York City that had recently undergone a major renovation. And the family and their security detail were leaving to go on a shopping spree in Manhattan. And they collected all of their belongings and believed that they had closed and locked the door behind them. And unbeknownst to them, what had happened was that despite the fact that the hotel had been renovated, they did not update the locks. And although the striker plate engaged, the locking mechanism did not. And as they say in life, timing is everything. And it just so happened that at that day and at that moment, right after they left, there was an individual who walked up the back stairs of the hotel and went floor by floor, room by room. And he was what is referred to as a push-in burglar. And what that means is that he's an individual who just goes and tries doors in the hotel to see if anyone left them unlocked. And even though this family from the Middle East did not leave the door unlocked, they heard it click and believed it to be locked behind them. In point of fact, it was not. And this individual went in and stole $250,000 worth of gems and jewelry. Now, the problem was more than just a monetary loss for this family from the Middle East, because the way that society works back in their home country, they are perceived as being the stewards of the oil wealth and the natural resources of the country. And this is a major embarrassment to them, because it makes it look as if they were careless with the national wealth. And so what happened was they came back and they called the police, and the police did what the police always do in such a setting, which is that they filed a report and they took initial information and they began an investigation. But fortunately, the security detail for the family had the foresight to reach out to Forhad and his colleagues at the time, and they actually took the level of the investigation up a notch with their own efforts, and they reached out to us on the legal side, particularly with my law enforcement background, and we each became involved in our own respective spheres, and ultimately an individual was apprehended. There was an issue that Forhad and his colleagues resolved very neatly, of having the property returned to this family so that they could return home with it and not have it remain behind as evidence in the criminal case. And so that was the problem that was taken care of for the moment. But unfortunately, due to the notoriety surrounding this family and their place in society in the Middle East, the newspapers got a hold of it, and it was front page news for several days in all of the tabloids, and it became a source of personal and national embarrassment for the family. And this is where the crisis management comes in, because obviously the family never expected this. They were completely caught unawares. They thought that because they had a security detail that they had done all that was necessary to prepare themselves in the event of a crisis. And so their level of preparedness was very low. Contrast that with the level of preparedness on the part of the hotel, and they immediately sprang into action with a counter narrative saying that the family was negligent and that they were careless and that they left their valuables basically unattended and unsecured. And that was the controlling narrative at the initial point of the investigation. And so, Forhad, when your team came in and then our team came in legally right behind you, immediately we were playing catch up because what had happened was that the folks at the hotel, because of their crisis management team and their level of preparedness, they were able to initially set the narrative. And we were dealing with many, many things, not the least of which was a cultural divide. Because the first thing that the family asked of us when they saw that not only was this all over the newspapers, but it was exploding on social media, was they turned to me and they said, well, shut down the internet. And I said, excuse me? And they said, shut it down, just shut down the internet. And I said, this is America, you can't do that. And they said, well, we can do it in our country. And in point of fact, they could, but it's not how things worked here. So what happened was that we had to set about the business of Forhad and your colleagues actually did a video showing how the lock was defective, and that when the door closed, it sounded as if it locked, and to all appearances, it did. When in point of fact, all you needed to do was lean against it and it pushed open. So what happened was that we, on the legal end, had to go around, and I believe that there were approximately 147 different social media entities that we contacted to have them unwind their stories and print corrections. And some of them were very nice and cooperative and collegial, and others not so much. And so we had to, basically tell them that we would commence litigation if they did not correct their story now that they knew the truth. And ultimately, we obtained compliance from everyone. But you need to look at how this all came about and how this could potentially have been avoided. And so, if the family had a complete crisis management team and a crisis management program, as the hotel did, they would have been able to set the narrative straight from the outset, rather than trying to, correct inaccurate stories for months thereafter and at great expense. And so it all circles back to how we began with the old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That was the first case that Forhad and I worked on together, and it was, as he said, the first of many that followed. But it was a really important object lesson for the family, who obviously increased all aspects of their security apparatus once they returned home. And Forhad and I have worked on other cases since that. Where people were in various levels of preparedness to deal with crises that impacted themselves, as on the corporate front, on the organizational front, or in the event of it being a high net worth individual or basically anyone. And so Forhad and I have a very clear concept of what crisis management means, and how to go about analyzing threats and preparing in the eventuality that one happens to you. Before we started the podcast today, Forhad and I were basically talking briefly about how this is an issue that deals with human nature, and psychologists, two prominent psychologists named Kamen and Tversky, did some interesting work in the field, saying that people are inherently resistant to prepare for crises because people have difficulty dealing with probabilities that they perceive as being small. Yeah. So what they'll do is they'll avoid preparation, thinking that it will never happen to them, and then when it does, they're caught completely unawares. And And the second half of their work that's very important to understand is that people don't properly give attribution to their preparedness as helping them avert disaster. The example that they use is, in an ordinary year, not a pandemic year necessarily, but when one goes to get a flu shot, if you go through the entire flu season without incident, very few of us in number will reflect back in March and say, gee, it was a great idea I had in September to get that flu shot because it helped me avert disaster or a calamity of a bad flu. So the moral of the story, there are assets available that can help in times of crisis preparation, and it's always good to know what your known threats are, what your unknown vulnerabilities may be, and all things being equal, with an ounce of preparation, individuals, corporations, or organizations can avoid what happened and befell this affluent family from the Middle East.
So, Jim, going back to one part of it, I really the point about the two sides, one extremely prepared and one not so much, right? For the hotel, can you talk a little bit about why this was a crisis for them? I mean, obviously, what to me it sounds like we knew that this was a pretty well-known high-end hotel, and they didn't want this out there as our hotel is unsafe, and if you come here, $250,000 worth of your stuff might get stolen, right? I mean, can you talk a little bit about why it was a crisis for them?
Right. It was a crisis for them because obviously they are in a market setting in Manhattan, in an area of the city where there are several high-end competing hotels that are all in competition with each other for the clientele that are high net worth individuals who can pay exceptionally large amounts of money for, in this case, the family from the Middle East basically took over a floor in the hotel. And so what happens is that in their national and international marketing, all of these very prestigious hotels want to make sure of the comfort level of their clientele. And part and parcel of that, obviously, is that they need to have luxury amenities that are competitive with other similarly situated hotels. They need to have a presence about them such that clients can come and go with complete anonymity. The third and most important piece is that above all else, the clientele needs to be secure in the knowledge that they are going to be safe personally, and that their possessions are going to be secure during the length of their stay. And so what happens is that in an event like this, if the truth had come out initially as to what had happened, it would have posed an existential crisis for the hotel, because I mean, look at the parade of horribles that happened. They basically had an individual who just was no more adept at burglary than opening up a ground floor door to a stairwell, was able to just basically go unimpeded from floor to floor and push against all of the doors in the hotel, and no one stopped him. And even though, and this goes back to what the psychologists say about probabilities. Nobody, what are the odds, as they say, of an individual just happening to be there in that moment, pushing on doors and coming upon a treasure trove, literally and figuratively, of gems. So for the hotel, this was a real threat to their very existence in that high net worth individual clientele market, and they needed to do everything that they could, and they did, to get out and get ahead of the story, be proactive, and set the narrative, despite the fact that the narrative wasn't accurate and that it was their fault.
Yeah.
You know, by the time everything was corrected, you know, as is so often the case, the corrections are printed in small print on page 6,
Yeah.
and you know, in this case, the hotel had the benefit of the fact that the family from the Middle East did not want continuing publicity, because that was just throwing kerosene on the fire that had already been ignited. So if for all intents and purposes, you know, the hotel won the day in terms of the you know, setting the narrative and avoiding the crisis that they themselves had created.
You know, it's interesting as I listen to you. So the family and essentially what they were sold on is, you know, high-end hotel, secure, you remain anonymous. All the things that you talked about actually ended up working against them in the end, right? Because to maintain all those things, the hotel had to go on the offense. So just pretty interesting points. I guess the outcome in the story turned out to be a good one, but I guess it could have easily gone the other way. So let's talk a little bit about what some of the things that the family could have done differently to avoid the potential damage it was facing, both loss of property and reputational damage.
Well, I think that one of the things, I mean, and that this will sound as if it's unique to this family given their special situation, but I think it applies in many of the settings as well. They thought that they really had a complete stranglehold on everything that they needed as far as security went. But what they left unattended was the fact that they were traveling in a foreign country. They were traveling in a culture that was much more open than the closed society they came from, and they thought that, you know, in the unlikely event that anything should happen, that they would have no trouble controlling the media and controlling the narrative, because they could just simply shut the internet down. And when reactivating the internet, they could control the stories that went out because of their prominence in their home country. And so if they had connections here, you know, basically what should have happened is that their security detail, and I basically spoke with individuals in their government subsequently, and they had the entire apparatus in place and just didn't activate it. They should have had an advance team working on the ground from the time that the airplane hit the tarmac until the time it was wheels up to go home, and they didn't. And it was, you know, part and parcel of that was that they just wanted to come and go quietly and anonymously, but they can do that and not have that aspect of their visit compromised, while at the same time being protected. And so if they had contacted, you know, a group such as yours, Forhad, to help with, you know, acting as liaison for security purposes while they were here, and made sure that they had access to attorneys if need be, access to public relations people if need be.
Yep.
And like any other insurance, you know, you have it with the hope and expectation that you're never going to need to use it. And all things being equal, most times you won't need it. But the one time that you do, you're really glad you have it.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, you just led into my next point. So, for a family like this, or really anyone, as you mentioned earlier, um, can you talk a little bit about that? You mentioned security, you mentioned legal, you mentioned, you know, others. What should a crisis management team be made up of for really anyone like this?
Well, it's made up of component parts, and you know, actually, in many circumstances, your operation will be the first to hear from people who are in the know and who are conscious and aware of how to go about putting together a crisis management team. And so your operation and your people were invaluable in that setting, going back to the hotel case, because I remember one of the real sticking points that we had was that the detectives and the DA's office in Manhattan very much wanted to keep all of the jewelry as evidence, and the family was aghast because there was no way they could leave the country without their possessions. And so, thankfully, your people were able to work as liaison with the police department, and were able to get the property returned. And so you can see how, it's not just on the investigative front where your operation became very important, but it was also because of the retired law enforcement people on the state and federal level that you have access to. They can speak the same language as the folks currently on the job, and we're able to to get things done for the client. And then on the legal end, obviously we had our work cut out for us in terms of trying to go around and put out the prairie fire of social media that just spread immediately from the time of the event. And another component is or operations that you and we have worked collectively with over the years, in terms of public relations people who have the access to back in the day, 25 years ago, it was just having the connections with print media, being able to get stories placed, but now it's so much more expansive than that, and the people on the public relations and the crisis management and the media front, it's almost like the print media is an afterthought, because it's Twitterverse and it's everything else that is out there that is now instantaneously telling a story, and content is king. So the news cycle is somewhere between 24 and 48 hours before the carnivorous internet monster needs more content. So what happens is that it's important that should anything happen in a crisis setting, whether it's for a corporation or an individual or an organization or some combination, that the team work together harmoniously as one entity to make sure that every aspect of the crisis is covered.
Yep, no, absolutely. And just again, you mentioned this many times as we talked here, but controlling the narrative, right? Again, what can you talk just a little bit about what does that mean? Why is it important, and how do you do it?
Sure, it's the narrative, obviously, as with any narrative, whether it's in literature or in life, is basically the story that's being told. And so just to make it concrete and go back to our hotel example, the narrative that should have been told from the outset was the truth. That's always a great place to start. And in this setting, if the family, the high net worth family, had been awares, what they would have done is have their crisis management team make sure that in the first instance that anything that could have been suppressed as far as a story getting out was suppressed. In this situation, that was extremely difficult, because once the police become involved and public records become involved, then the Pandora's box opens. So you need to have a team in place that understands that that ecosystem, such that they know that this is not a story that's going to be able to be kept under wraps. And then once that happens, it's a question of getting out first with the facts in a compelling storytelling way as to what happened. So, for example, in this setting, it would have been that this family came to the Middle East, that they're a prominent family who were looking to cement ties with the United States, culturally, individually, and diplomatically. They were traveling with diplomatic passports, and that despite their best efforts, that the place where they chose to stay did not fulfill its obligations to them and their representations to them in terms of their ability to keep them safe and secure in person and possessions throughout the pendency of their stay. And that being the case, had they been able to get that narrative out, they would have been back on the ground in their home country, and the hotel would have still been scrambling to put together a counter narrative. And so the problem in this circumstance was that the counter narrative, the false narrative, became the prevailing narrative because of the timeliness of it and the extensive contacts that the hotel already had in place for just such a circumstance.
Yeah, it's interesting, even about the story, just talking about preparedness and having people that are already thinking about this in advance. I'm not even sure that they considered the fact that the story was going to get out, right? That's just this sort of subtle, interesting thing, is that I think that's what caught them by surprise is, all right, how did this story get out so quickly? They weren't even thinking that the hotel or whomever may already be on the offense, right? As soon as the event happened, right?
Right. Well, there were two things working against them. One was that they were obviously still just in the aftermath of the personal aftershock of having been violated and having their possessions invaded and stolen. And then the second thing was that never in a million years did they ever contemplate the impact that visiting a free society could have in terms of freedom of press and freedom of expression under the First Amendment, and that basically there was there was no way to to contain the story at all. In their country, no one would dare to print anything negative about this family.
Right.
And if there was anything in any surrounding country that seemed to be problematic, they would just completely shut down access to the internet, so nobody in their country would be the wiser. And so that was that was an issue for them, a real shock for them, because they never properly took into account the cultural differences. It's like we should always be aware when we travel to another country, that it's not like going to Kansas. You are in another country, and they have different laws, and they have different cultural dictates, and and it's very it's very important that you that you understand and that you fit in and that you comply. I mean, years ago there was a story about Americans who were in Singapore, and they threw chewing gum on the sidewalk, and they were publicly caned for it, because that's how their society operates. And so whenever we're traveling in a foreign country, you need to be respectful and observant of local culture and rules and laws, and the cultural component of that can't be overstated. And the same thing is true for folks from foreign countries who are coming here. In many respects, to other closed societies, this must seem like the Wild West to them when they come, because it is such an open society.
Sure. So going back to a point you made early on in this discussion about thinking about real possibilities, right? So thinking about what might actually happen and sort of addressing it that way. So do you think preparedness is the norm or the aberration, and why?
Well, it's the aberration, because as we were discussing earlier about the psychological studies that have been performed, no one likes to think that they're at risk ever, despite the fact that they may be at risk. Even if one is in a perilous situation, If you're, in a bar in a bad section of town and it's late at night at closing time and things are beginning to look a little sketchy, each of us would still somehow muster the courage to believe that, you're going to be okay and get back to your car without incident. And that's just human nature, because we never want to believe that something bad's going to happen. And again, based on the work of the psychologists, people have difficulty dealing with and believing in the fact that something bad can happen, because they minimize the prospect and believe that the probability is so small that it's not even worth considering. And unfortunately today, that's not a prudent way to go about one's affairs.
Sure. No, those are all absolutely great points. And, this has been just a great discussion. I think people, even if I think people know this deep down as they think about it, to some it may seem obvious, to some it may not. I think it's important that the message gets out and people think about it. So thank you all for tuning into this episode. Please send your comments and questions to info@integrusintel.com. If you'd like to connect with Jim, we'll put his firm's link in the description. And thank you, Jim, for joining us, and thank you for your friendship and everything that we've been able to do together over the years. Needless to say, I greatly value it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, Forhad.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.